Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue with our study of the Gilded Age by diving into national politics, and specifically the influence of all the big businesses we talked about last time on specifically the Republican Party, but also to some extent the Democratic Party, and how all this led to create a system in which the parties became mostly indistinguishable and politics became super messy and personal. So that'll be fun. Let's dive into that. Here are our objectives for today. Take a moment and pause and make sure you can take them in, and we'll move forward. As you hopefully remember, we're technically still in the third party system, maybe? I mean, the third party system is, of course, Republicans and versus Democrats. And the main issue, at least at this point, was the issue of slavery. And so now that slavery, and specifically Republicans' opposition to slavery and Democrats' support of slash ambivalence about slavery, that is now gone, we're back to basically the second party system in which they're sort of against economic issues. And so there's a whole bunch of different reforms that sort of fall down across both sides. We've got the whole issue of currency reform, the tariff issue, as far as Republicans pushing a higher tariff, Democrats pushing a lower tariff. We've got civil service reform and the spoils system and how we feel about that at this point. Plus, there's waving the bloody shirt, this whole thing where Democrats are blamed for the Civil War by Republicans, and that's used to win national elections. And then we've got a bunch of sort of third parties and branch off parties, stalwarts and half-breeds, mugwumps, populists, the Greenback Party. It's a hot mess. And in general, both parties are taking massive amounts of money from big businessmen. And yeah, the third party system, especially the second phase of the third party system, is going to be really hard to navigate. So we'll do our best here. But if you're not totally following all of this, it's okay. It's super confusing. So here's the politics of the Gilded Age. Take a moment, read this, and answer the appropriate questions, and then we'll move on. The main issue, or the main things influencing all of this stuff, is patronage. We talked previously about the spoils system and how during the age of Jacksonian democracy, people who helped out with a campaign could be expected to get some level of government job. Well, now industrialists are taking over various industries, and they are now bankrolling various political parties. These political bosses are then trying to pick the right connection of people to put into jobs in order to appease these various industrialists. And this becomes the main factor here, as people like Roscoe Conkling of New York are trying to use his influence and control, and especially the wealth of New York in general, to affect politics and to control sort of the rest of the party. This is going to be a hot mess, and it's going to lead to a lot of problem and conflict within parties. In the election of 1880, Roscoe Conkling and his allies are going to be pushing Ulysses Grant to come back and run for a third term. No one was happy with the third term of Rutherford B. Hayes. Everyone wanted to put the Compromise of 1877 behind them. And so there was this massive push to nominate Grant for a third term because the last couple terms were so great. Because maybe he'd look the other way and allow big businesses to basically do whatever they wanted. Anyway, well, it's not totally clear. Maybe he would just be a pawn to Roscoe Conkling. Who knows? Anyway, the guy that they went with instead, Roscoe Conkling was unable to convince most of the Republican Party to support Ulysses Grant. And instead, they went from a young senator from Ohio named James Garfield. James Garfield was a brilliant politician, a committed reformer, a Civil War general, because, it's the era after the Civil War. Everyone's an important Civil War general, ended up being able to unite the party and win the Republican ticket. He was able to bring together the two main branches of the party, Roscoe Conkling and his stalwarts, and James Blaine and his half-breeds. And he's going to challenge the status quo by pushing back against this patronage system, vowing to push for reform. Here we see an incredibly swole Farmer Garfield cutting a swath to the White House with his sigh of honesty, ability, and patriotism. For the Democrats, they're pretty much screwed at this point. The bloody shirt is still being waved. The whole idea that Democrats are somehow copperheads who are disloyal and responsible for the Civil War is still widespread. The hard feelings over the conflict are still pretty fresh. And so waving the bloody shirt is going to be super effective. The Democrats are going to nominate a Civil War general themselves named Hancock, but you can see the weight of the history here, coupled with anti-Irish sentiment. assuming that's supposed to be an Irish person, is going to weigh down the Democratic candidate and lead to a pretty easy election for James Garfield, at least electorally, winning all the northern states. And if this election looks very depressing to you after just fighting a whole civil war, yeah, all of us see that. So James Garfield gets elected, and there's a real sense that we're going to move forward, that he's going to actually push reform, that there are going to be changes made, that society is going to move forward. And then he's assassinated. Charles Guiteau, a office seeker who believed that he played a huge role in James Garfield's rise to power, and who wanted to be the ambassador to France, and then for some reason was completely shocked when James Garfield had no idea who he was and didn't make him the ambassador to France, came up behind Garfield in a train station and shot him in the back. Here's Guiteau's explanation as far as why he did it. I'll let you read it and assess what you think of Charles Guiteau here. So pause, read, let's move on. James Garfield, he was not killed by the wound, but they had trouble getting the bullet out of him. And so as his health was somewhat failing, they brought in Alexander Graham Bell, who had invented a rudimentary metal detector to try to find the bullet. But unfortunately, they did not account for the fact that James Garfield was laying on a bed with metal springs. And so they kept rooting around in the wound in order to try to get the bullet out, and James Garfield died of infection. So gross and sad. So James Garfield's dead. Instead, we're going to get Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur was a middling, uninspiring politician. And his ascension is basically means that the forces of reform are not going to have a vigorous candidate pushing for them. As you can read here, Chester A. Arthur is mostly going to be concerned with what pants he's wearing. And as far as the Republican establishment goes, they're going to mostly do whatever they want. So as opposed to a vigorous era of reform and America moving forward, instead, Chester A. Arthur is going to try on some different pants. And yeah. The one thing we did decide to do is pass the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which would theoretically solve the problem of prospective ambassadors to France not assassinating the president. This is supposed to establish a competitive series of examinations for civil service and to get rid of the spoils system. So here you can read the different powers of the Pendleton Act. So take a moment to pause, take it in, and we'll move on. It kind of worked. The problem is it's the Gilded Age. There's unlimited money flying around. It did establish some competitive examinations, but those could be bypassed if you could provide, several million good reasons why you were qualified, possibly in an unmarked bag. And so the end effect was, instead of having candidates beholden to lots of small donors to get jobs, instead they were beholden to the people who would bribe them the most. Which step forward? I'll let you decide for yourself. We did get a bill modernizing the Navy, creating our first sort of modern battleships, because we had fallen somewhat behind the rest of the world. And the age of the battleship means that if you don't have a cutting edge battleship, naval battles are going to go really poorly for you. So these are our white side battleships that are going to show up, right around the Spanish-American War. So once we start talking about our battleship fleet, just again, know it comes from this era. And for the election of 1884, we're going to see totally new candidates. 84, the Republicans are going to go a different way. They tried to go for a reformer, and then they had Chet, who was somewhat of a stalwart. So now we're going to go with the half-breed side of the Republican Party. And the Republicans are going to nominate James Blaine of Maine. Unfortunately, James Blaine of Maine is spectacularly corrupt. There's a huge amount of political cartoons lambasting him for basically selling himself to a variety of different companies, embezzling money from the public, and all of this. And so the Republicans are going to nominate a spectacularly corrupt candidate to face off against a spectacularly not corrupt candidate. This is Grover Cleveland of New York. He's a former lawyer. When he was governor of New York, he in general ruled with a sort of moderation. He's known for being very honest and straightforward and being relatively conservative. And so he's going to bring in a sense of common sense and just good governance back to American society. And so Grover Cleveland is the Democratic candidate. Unfortunately, for Grover Cleveland, he was unmarried. And he may have had a kid. So I'll let you connect those two things together in order to give you a sense of what young Grover Cleveland might have been up to. And so the Republicans, in order to slander Cleveland, come up with a bunch of fabulous political attacks. My favorite is the song "Ma Ma, Where's My Pa," in which they again try to slander Grover Cleveland for having a child outside of wedlock. But Grover Cleveland does the thing that he always does, and he's honest and straightforward about it. He admits, yes, I had a physical relationship with this woman. Yes, she gave birth to a child. I did not know if the child was mine or not, but I did all the responsible things that I'm supposed to do. I provided an educational fund for the child. I found a nice foster family to raise them. I had the mother committed to an insane asylum. I did all the various things and tied up all the loose ends that one should do when they're fathering a child outside of wedlock in the 1800s. And so the public in general accepted Grover Cleveland's responsible actions, and it didn't overly hurt him, making Grover Cleveland the first Democrat and the only Democrat to be elected in between the Civil War and the Progressive Era. So as far as Gilded Age Democrats, it's only Grover Cleveland. Cleveland, of course, is going to do all the things that he should generally do. He's going to get married immediately to Frances Folsom. So there's going to solve the problem of Grover Cleveland not being married. Of course, because it's Grover Cleveland, the whole thing is super creepy because she was technically, she was like in her 20s at the time, so she's almost 30 years younger than him. She was the daughter of one of his close friends, and he was her legal guardian for a decent portion of her childhood. So, ick. But from all accounts, it was a relatively happy marriage. She was a very popular first lady, a trendsetter, all this fun stuff, and Grover Cleveland was able to answer all the questions about why aren't you married. During the Cleveland administration, we're going to see the power of big business really start to exert itself, and there's a huge push that maybe we need to do something about these wealthy billionaires who are more or less above the law and able to do whatever they want. Cleveland did not believe in a vigorous government, and so here's his veto of the Texas Seed Bill. He is going to use the veto more times than any other president prior to him, and is going to really try to scale back the size of the federal government. So take a moment and pause and read his explanation here. He's also going to cut pensions for Civil War veterans and is going to try to really cut down on government spending, leading to a pretty spectacular surplus. And so he's also going to push to lower the tariff, which is going to lead to a huge pushback from industrialists and urban workers. So he's cutting spending, he's trying to lower taxes, he's cutting pensions for greedy Civil War veterans, which you can think however you want about that. And he's going to try to start regulating railroad rates in order to reform the economy and get our society back on track. As part of this, we get an act to regulate commerce, which I'll let you pause and read. This Interstate Commerce Act was an attempt for the federal government to enforce interstate commerce and to push back against railroad companies who had been making spectacular amounts of money. But it was not very well applied during this time period because, again, bribery was commonplace. And so it was very difficult for a low-paid government bureaucrat to resist the allure of, 3 to 5 million reasons why I didn't violate the Interstate Commerce Act. But it's a law that's passed, even if it's not broadly enforced. So that's the politics of the Gilded Age. We've got Grover Cleveland. We've got some reform that's not evenly passed. For next time, we're going to zoom in on cities and look at how all the pressures of growing industrialism is going to reform municipal and local governments. It's going to be a mess. So look forward to that. And thank you for listening.